it gives us a chance to jump off into something I did want to talk to you about today, which is circumcision. Now, the reason I bring that up is I was 19 before I came to the United States, and up until that point in my life, I never thought once about the fact that I was uncircumcised. I come from England. Basically, nobody's circumcised. And I came to America, and all the dudes, it comes up in conversation for some reason, and everybody's circumcised. And now then you have a baby here, and they want to circumcise your baby and all that stuff, and that could potentially be traumatic. What's your thinking about the reason you chose not to circumcise your son?
So that's a great question. I come from a very religious family. And so it tends to be that circumcision is that religious ritual. And what I think happened in the United States is that companies began to capitalize on that religious ritual and perpetuated it in a way that it just became the norm, whether you were in a religion or not. They somehow, and I don't know how exactly, but I mean, it definitely spawns from the religious ritual, right? I come from a Christian conservative family. That's how I grew up. That's how I was raised. Now, again, I've begun to form my own opinions on a lot of things, and I don't necessarily find myself in the same camp as a lot of my family members, but I was absolutely told, these are how you do things. This is what you do when you have a son. That was just kind of normal for me. But I did not know I was going to have a son. So backstory on my birth, I had a home birth and I did not know what gender I was having. And the entire time I thought I was having a girl. So when I tell you that circumcision did not even come up in my peripherals whatsoever, it was not even a thought. So I have a son. My husband again comes from a culture where being circumcised is more so in the cities. It's a little bit more from the industrial culture, but being out in different parts, like in the jungle, they're certainly not partaking in that. In small towns in Chiclayo, it's certainly not the norm. So he was kind of like, I mean, we kind of said, let's talk about it. What is this? And I told him, I was like, well, here's what I've been told. And I had talked to my midwife, and she was like, you go and do research. And when she says that, that means, hey, Abby, go dig into the industry behind this and why it's so popular here, essentially. So I did that. And I realized how just like the placenta is worth $50,000+, for stem cell companies usually, and these companies that are harvesting stem cells. The same thing is going on with the foreskin of infants. And I began to realize that there are companies in the US that are making billions of dollars off the foreskins of infants. Billions of dollars. Now they're able to take the foreskin of an infant and grow enough stem cells to cover something like multiple football fields, because it's just an insane, I mean, it's incredible what this tissue is able to do, but it's being used for things that are not great, right? So the main places that a lot of these stem cells essentially get sold to are cosmetic companies. And so there's this huge chain that's going on now where these cosmetic companies have crazy products and procedures. One of them is called the penis facial. Celebrities get it. And we know, I mean, I personally don't trust a celebrity whatsoever with a 10-foot pole. But I mean, that was where I saw the industry going. And then I started reading the research, because they like to tout a lot of information at you when you're considering circumcising or not. And they'll say, well, it's healthier for the baby, and it's X, Y, or Z, and it's cleanly, and it's this. And then I got into the research, and I was looking at stuff from Europe, and I was looking at stuff in South America and all this stuff. And I'm like, oh wait, they have a potential to have there's a 25% chance that nerve damage is permanent in these infants. And the procedure in and of itself is the infant is screaming in excruciating pain, like this can't be normal. And I had opted for I opted for almost pretty much no intervention in my birth whatsoever. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I had one midwife and that was it. It was pretty much me, myself, and my husband.
Amazing.
And so I just felt a real conviction to look into it a little bit more and just realize the financial gains that were
Mm.
occurring. And it didn't sit right with me. And like the religious ritual wasn't enough for me to say, oh yeah, this makes sense. This religious ritual makes sense to me. Like I understand why I need to put my, brand new infant son under excruciating pain to like give him a cleanlier, like a quote unquote cleanlier life, free of, whatever. It did not make any sense. And so I went down that rabbit hole. And
Yep.
I then started sharing that with friends that were having boys.
Mm-hmm.
And they also started taking the same decisions of like, hey, this doesn't make sense. So yeah,
Well,
there's a lot there.
it's an interesting conversation to have because when you take the stance, and I can say it openly, coming from a culture where it's not normal at all, that is a weird thing that America does. What you potentially run into is defensiveness from parents who don't want to acknowledge that they didn't really think about that because it's so ingrained in culture as a normal thing. And you have these convenient explanations for it, like religious belief, that they almost had to do it. And maybe if they think about it logically for a second, they go, actually, yeah, wait a minute, it doesn't make much sense. But they don't want to acknowledge that because it acknowledges that they potentially unnecessarily harmed their own child. And that's a really hard thing to think about, And the one thing that I've thought about a lot, just kind of like having this conversation come up more and more, and then having two sons, and we had a home birth, no interventions, all of that stuff too, which is great because that means you don't have to have this fight. But it's just, I certainly felt that can't be good for somebody, a living being that's just came out of the womb where everything is taken care of and he's connected to mom. And then all of a sudden, within like a few hours, we're putting him on a table and doing some pretty gnarly procedure that's going to produce pain that could potentially have lasting effects trauma-wise. But I did not make the connection until you started talking about it. And I need to look at some of this stuff myself, that of course, there is a financial thing here. There always is. As you said, like meeting your husband and realizing that culture eats nose to tail. The pharmaceutical and medical industry in America is nose to tail in terms of there is no waste. It's not going to throw those foreskins away if it can make a profit from them. So that's very, very interesting and kind of makes sense how it's become so pervasive. But I did want to talk to you about that because I do think these kinds of conversations, they're uncomfortable sometimes, but they need to be had so people can make empowered decisions. I'm not going to sit here, and I don't think you're sitting here saying don't do it. I think you're just saying like, hey, here's something to think about.